All right, so chapter 8, Herbart, Schopenhauer.
Where
How's
do
it?
we want to start? Does anyone want to go first? If not, I'll go. I'll go.
Go for it, John.
I'll share a quote real quick and
Okay, please,
then maybe.
please go for that.
Just I think it's sort of the essence of the chapter. It just in Steiner's presentation of certain thinkers who are worth knowing about in the effort to understand the potential of the age. And so on page 229 of the PDF that I have, this is like just after the beginning of a paragraph. He says, Herbart is in another sense than Goethe, Schiller, Schelling, Fichte, and Hegel a representative of the development of modern world conception. Those thinkers attempt a representation of the self-conscious soul in a world picture capable of containing this self-conscious soul as an element. So that's sort of like the goal. In doing so, they become the spokesman for the spiritual impulse of their age, whereas Herbart is confronted with this impulse and he must admit the feeling that this impulse is there. He attempts to understand it, but in the form of thinking that he imagines to be the correct one. He finds no possibility of penetrating into the life of the self-conscious being of the soul. Anyway, I just thought that might be a helpful touchstone with the various different ways of, different examples of thinkers who didn't quite meet that, I guess. Anyway, what do you think, John?
Oh yeah, that's great. I'm sort of looking at the antipathy, perhaps. What did he call it? He didn't call it antipathy. Um,
Contradiction.
the polarity. Yeah, the polarity between Schopenhauer and
okay.
Schopenhauer and Hegel. The withdrawal that Schopenhauer recommended. He desired desirelessness, and he had a kind of Buddhist orientation, that kind of renunciation, and the kind of Hegelian wanting to get engaged and reconcile with life. That, I think, is what Steiner is pointing to as a difference that makes a difference between these two thinkers. And I think it's going on and on and on in this chapter and in between different chapters that we've studied. So there's a long quote I wrote down about Schopenhauer's insistence that art was the purest art form because it's the most withdrawn, he claims, from nature.
Music.
Yeah. Music does, that's what I meant to say. Oh, yeah, music does not copy anything in nature. Okay. That's Schopenhauer's claim. And I found this as I was reading. I said, no, that can't be right. And then Steiner comes along and agrees with me. Because I don't think music is withdrawn from nature at all, if that's what Schopenhauer meant to say, call pure. Anyway, I want to bring in a few questions that our group has already asked. Jeff in the volley asks three very important questions as he's reflecting upon this chapter. How do we cohere? What do we do now? How do we tap into another kind of agency? I'm not quoting you exactly right there, but you were talking about agency. Also, Jonathan Townsend in the volley, the image of roadkill as animal sacrifice. How roadkill is perhaps an animal sacrifice to this modernist contraption that we're all caught up in. So I'm bringing those questions forward because I had an experience this morning that resonated, I believe, with a lot of these questions that are being asked and our current life worlds that we're all creating together. But I also want to remember an anecdote from, I think this is a couple of decades ago, very famous incident that happened in a New York subway. a man with two toddlers, one in a carriage, was on the platform, and another man, a stranger, had an epileptic seizure and fell onto the train track as the train was coming into the station. The man with the children said to the crowd, who was horrified, "Watch my kids." He jumped onto the train track, threw his body over the man who was having the seizure. As the train rolled into the station, rolled right over them, and the people on the platform were screaming in horror. Well, what happens next? Both men survived without a scratch, okay? Now, I think the man who had the seizure had a few minor scrapes and bruises, but the man who saved his life was fine. And he was asked, what most people would ask is like, what were you thinking when you did this? And he says, I wasn't thinking at all. I did what anyone would do. Well, obviously that's not true. He's the only one who did this. But what fascinates me, and this has haunted me for years, for decades, I've contemplated this, because the man with the children was a black man. The man he saved was a white man. So there wasn't a racial identity that was operative here. The children he abandoned on the platform were his offspring. So it's not some sort of selfish genetics that the man is protecting. So what kind of thinking? I think the man was thinking, but it wasn't a propositional logic that he was using. It wasn't some sort of cost benefit analysis. I think he was thinking the way a dancer thinks. Okay. And I just want to share something, an anecdote that I had this morning as I was in the park that I think relates to or resonates with, not nearly as dramatically as what happened with this incident, with this very heroic gesture this man made and saved another man's life, a total stranger. And why I believe that he was thinking like a dancer. Okay, so this is at the park. I take my shoes off. I'm sitting in the ground with my feet on the ground. I'm leaning up against a tree, sipping my coffee. It's fall. It's cold. People are not walking around barefoot. I do this intentionally because I'm into the earth mode, right? I notice obviously a crazy guy with a wild beard, very dirty, and he's barefoot too. And he walks up to another tree about 50 feet away from me. And he looks at that tree and he sort of freezes into a cataleptic gaze at the tree. And he sort of does a kind of sculpture with his body of the tree. And then there is also a trunk of a dead tree lying on the ground. And with his bare feet, he hops onto this dead trunk of the tree and he does a kind of strange kind of dance. And I'm looking at him from the corner of my eye, simply because I've learned you don't look directly at a crazy person, okay? But I was watching him, observing him, and he knew I was observing him because he steps off of the tree and he walks right into not my peripheral vision, but my foot, I guess that's your foveal vision, the center of my visual attention. And he makes a gesture that is obviously intended for my awareness. And I absorb this, and then he moves off, just like a child and is running around. I found that my feeling was, as I was watching him, this is a feeling that this is a duet between this wild man and his environment. And then when he looked at me and made a gesture, the duet became a trio. So I'm in an intersubjective space with him. So I think what's happening here is rhythms, shared rhythms that get faster and louder and amplify and enhance and then weaken some more, disappear. So that's my feeling, that there was an unheard music that the man that I was sharing with this wild man, and then since I'm a wild man too, I guess, since we're both barefooted walking around, but I think the man who saved the other man's life on that platform, so that man who had the seizure fell on the platform, did not become roadkill. Okay, this man, I think, he was tuned into the rhythms of an unheard music, just as I think it was Dreisch who cut the frog embryo in half, and the frog, and it did not produce half of a frog. It produced an entire whole frog, but it was a smaller frog. In that way, there is a melody that the notes, that hides behind the notes. So you have this note, that note, that note. It's in a sequence, but the melody is not in the notes, nor the accumulation of notes. And in this same way, analogously, and this is very Goethean, very Steinerian, I think this runs through the fossil record. If you look at the vertebrae, the spines of many different creatures who are our ancestors, and how their skulls and spines work, you can see patterns. And these are variations upon many different themes. So once again, the fossil record of there are huge gaps, but we can still reconstruct, as I believe Goethe did when he went out into the field and tried to imagine what the interiors of a plant, as it moves from a seed into the roots, into that shaft, into the flower, the expression. This was like watching, for him, I think, a 3-act play. I mean, he was able to fill in those gaps with his imagination. So I'm using my imagination here. It's maybe a little incoherent. I'm not, but I'm thinking the kind of, how do we cohere? What do we do now? How do we tap into another kind of agency? I think that's what we're all attempting to do by appearing here. Our very busy lives are putting aside this time to read this very difficult text and to share, hopefully, at another level of our being than that we're typically engaged in when we're doing the business of life. Okay, thanks very much for your attention, and I'm really looking forward to your responses to this text. Thanks.
You know, it's interesting, John, these anecdotes you've shared remind me of what's said on the very page that Ashton read from, about the difference between a spectator consciousness and a participatory mode of thinking, which is how Steiner contrasts Herbart and Hegel. And, you know, what you're talking about, the rhythm of the world process, and the way in which, I think, as we become more and more susceptible to this spectator mode of consciousness, we look out at the world, and so when we absent ourselves and our thinking from the world process, the rhythm seems to break down a bit. Because maybe, as in the old picture consciousness, where the music of the spheres was just there for us, given to us, right? Now we need to participate. But before we achieve this new mode of conscious participation, the world rhythm seems to exclude us, and you know, Schopenhauer seems, maybe his characterization of music is a result of his withdrawal from the world, and in emphasizing the import of this Hegelian form of thought, which at first can seem very abstract, but is in fact just a more inward form of the world rhythm that we ourselves are producing. So anyways, I found that resonance interesting. I'm not sure if that's what you were intending to bring forward, but it seems to connect up.
That works for me. Thank you, Matt.
I see Jonathan's hand.
Yeah, John, I was wondering do you think that Schopenhauer would say that the dancer and the gentleman at the railway station and you and the other gentleman were thinking with your will.
Oh, I had an intention, and I believe that the wild man who's dancing barefoot not too far away from me, I believe he had an intention too, but I don't, and I do think the riddle of the ego is, he was not ego free, nor am we, no, excuse me, he was not egoless. I am not egoless. We have egos. We can be ego free. And I think this is the riddle of the ego, is that we have to have one, but that's not all that we are. And each of us has to find that in-betweenness, just like we can find a melody in a complex symphony we've never heard before. So thank you for that question. I hope that made sense to you.
Yes, yes. I'm wondering if it's not just like an in-betweenness. I mean, I'm not maybe disagreeing with you, but maybe just looking at it slightly differently, but a comprehensiveness. So, because it strikes me like the gentleman on the train platforms, I wasn't thinking. So according to himself, he just acted. And I'm wondering if Schopenhauer would look at that and say, yes, he was acting out of the world will, you know, so not unfree or anything like that, and not, so sort of his life was being considered through the world will. And that is the case, then I think that's very encouraging, because Rudolf said, from his perspective, Schopenhauer is the first to bring a piece of my words, but a piece of sort of the human being as a world principle. Whereas I think the sense is what Hegel had a more comprehensive thing, but it was more as a sort of almost a spectator. But Schopenhauer said, no, that our will is the world will. And if so, and if like we and dancers and this gentleman are able to touch on that, then maybe, you know, we're sort of going some way, because Schopenhauer does come after Hegel and everyone. And although in this chapter, these folks are characterized as reactionary, I think it's kind of, you know, the chapter begins with the bud and the flower and the fruit. And Hegel, and people could say these are contradictory, you know, so Schopenhauer disagrees with Hegel, etc. But you can look at them as that only contradiction in the sense that they sort of, you know, within a whole, they're parts of it. So could these fellows in this chapter be contradiction in the sense, I mean, does the fruit contradict the petals of the flower? And yet it is bringing an advance of it. But it's not a fullness, but.
Right, not a fullness yet. There's an expression that is, and the previous notes in the melody are required for that expression to reach its fullness. But there could be polarities within that. So parts of the flower can be polarized with other parts of the flower. And that's the drama that I think Goethe was capturing in that, I don't know, that 20-year project he spent out in the fields of Italy and in his own neighborhood, looking at the different expressions of the same species of plant in different locations. But there was a sameness and a difference. And it's that self-differencing that I believe he was most fascinated by. And I think you're bringing that up, Jonathan. I think, are you in a car?
I am, yes.
Well, I just had to tell you something. And I think this has something to do with polarity and tempo rhythms, because there was a moment while you were talking when your voice froze and your head sort of flipped around on my screen. Okay, and then the head came back to where it started, and the voice came back. See, to me, that's an interruptus. Something got interrupted.
Someone was trying to call me.
For a few seconds, and then something returned. And in that gap and that interruption, I had to fill something in. Okay. Because that's what our brains do. If there's a gap, we fill that gap in. You know?
Well, we tend to.
Yeah. And I think that's what our technology is rearranging our sensoriums very quickly right now. And I think if we're not aware of the gaps, we're going to be in real trouble. But if we can and do it responsibly, fill in those gaps, even though we know we're not getting it right. There's a lot of things that happen in the gap that I'm not aware of. But I think if we can do that, we will be fulfilling some of our obligation to create a coherent we space together. So thank you for that, Jonathan.
I want to return to this reactionary radical distinction that Steiner's making, but let's hear from Lorenzo first.
Yeah, thanks. I wanted to bring my, sorry about the cat. Wait a second.
Jonathan has a cat too that likes to be on camera, I noticed, in the follies.
Come on. So I wanted to bring my, let's say, numerological point of view to the problem regarding, again, the concept of three or tertiarity, let's say, and distinguishing between the state of conscience that we can presume the other people at the ground station had relating to the state of consciousness that the man who jumped had, because we can find a difference in their behavior. And we were talking, yeah, he was not egoless, but there was a difference in his ego, let's say, in the way his ego worked. And I think that what happened, we were talking about harmony and rhythms. So it's like that there was an overarching being that comprised that man and the surroundings as, let's say, a larger being than just the individuation of his own body, and that he allowed, let's say, himself to get in the rhythm of this greater being that has, let's say, stricter harmonic rules to be in, as different to those of the individuals that were less harmonical and more fixated on themselves. The fundamental difference, I think, is that he was being a medium while he let himself be a medium, while the others didn't. We can acoustically, we would say that he was, let's say, reactive and elastic, while the others were opaque and deafening. And so if he was a medium, he implied to others an input and an output. When there is a medium, of course, we have three. Otherwise, there is no middle to. And this difference between a two-sided vision or a three-sided vision is, again, what we were talking about as a difference between the philosophers like Hegel, Schelling, Fichte, who managed to, let's say, tackle the fundamental problem of the era, as opposed to those like Herbert that could only see an opposition, or like Schopenhauer too, could only see an opposition between, let's say, will and representation, and or appearance and of relationships that are just epiphenomenons and real invisible abstract entities behind it.
That's beautiful, Lorenzo. I just wanted to respond because you really helped me illuminate that anecdote, which has haunted my imagination for decades. Because I think the man, as he leaped onto the track, he was leaping into another reality. And it was a reality that I don't think wasn't about true false propositions. And I think he created that new reality through another reality, through his participation, in a way that the people on the track who just stood there in horror were understandably cut off, or they were conforming to, the chorus in an opera, who just shout in horror at something that the participants are acting out on stage. So I think that illuminates very much, I think, what I was probably trying to carry forward by presenting this very unusual anecdote to all of our considerations. So thank you, Lorenzo, very much. That helped me a lot.
No, thank you. It's a kind of paradox, the paradox of kenosis, because just when he empties himself and becomes a medium, he actually becomes an active part of the decision of the overarching being that actually creates reality that the other ones then just have to respond to. And it's again the rhythm. It's like a game with turns, and the larger and the overarcher, the being, the first he plays, and then the others just cannot just play. They cannot but play in response to that.
I would just add, though, in that kenosis, in that emptying himself out, he's not free of desire. He's not desireless.
No, I agree. He's following something that is also good for himself. He's not, what he said was maybe partially socially driven.
Anyone who hasn't shared yet want to jump in on this? Or if not, I was going to go back to the way that Hegel seems to be functioning for Steiner in the last few chapters, and it seems also in the next chapter, as this fulcrum, to hold the center, as it were, between the reactionaries and the radicals, where reaction for Steiner seems to imply reacting, like revolting against the world, withdrawing from the world, right? Whereas we haven't read chapter 9 yet on the radicals, but he hints at the end of this chapter that they are not, even though they're inheriting, Rouge and others are inheriting Hegel's thought, they do what Marx did, which is they're not faithful to Hegel's attempt to understand the world, but rather they want to change it. And so the radical for Steiner would seem to maybe lean too much into forcing the world to be different, whereas the reactionaries are just abandoning the world as it is, and that there's this mediating influence that Steiner seems to point to Hegel to help us understand, that would hold these two imbalanced impulses together. We don't want to withdraw from the world. We don't want to force the world to be other than it is, but somehow participate in it in a way that's balanced, right? That seems to be what Steiner's trying to do by opposing the reactionary to the radical, though we'll see where he goes in chapter 9. This is just a hypothesis. I haven't actually read this book before, so this is new for me. Is that how you guys are understanding this distinction he's making, or between the radical and the reactionary?
I haven't read not recently the next chapter, so you're saying that's the radicals, but what you just said makes a lot of sense. And Rudolf Steiner goes somewhere else from Hegel as well, so that's very interesting. If Hegel's like the balancing point, what perhaps prompted by what I've understood before from reading this book and others is, and makes a lot of sense to me, is that is fine, but there's something more for us than a role of just kind of like in the rhythm of the harmonies. And even more than just being aware, one is, like, say, with Hegel, being fully conscious of the music and how it's playing out in everything above and below us. So, you know, sort of in response to what you were just saying, sort of, there's something in me that says, yes, I want to be in balance with the harmonies, but and this might just be, you know, the way I'm taking it, where I'm coming from. To me, that seems a bit passive, and I want it to be an active role, so that I'm not, you know, I'm a note in the symphony rather than just listening to it.
Can I jump in?
Mm-hmm.
That last part about an active versus almost mediumistic approach, I think, is an important one, because Steiner, I mean, Hegel and Schelling and that sort of continuum of folks who are sort of, now we perceive them as countercultural. They were in a battle, in a certain sense, with, well, for the soul, is what I've intimated before. That the way in which the soul needs to be taken hold of and developed in a way that was just natural to Goethe. And so that the sort of, maybe the heroic act is emblematic or indicative of what's possible when the intuition is engaged, say, or the will is transformed, or desire is transformed into a higher form of perception. I have a couple ways I want to go, but I think I just leave it at that. That it's, Steiner's basically, I think, using Hegel to say, here's the person who is right for his time. It's not enough for our time. And here goes Schopenhauer off into this abstract world will that is in Philosophy of Freedom, he basically calls him a slacker, sort of the philosophy of slackerism, like 100 years ahead of his time, right? My generation of Gen X slackers. So I think he's more and more engaging us to see that this isn't just Schopenhauer's move in the way he accepts the essentially the philosophy of the unconscious will, isn't just part of this organism that's going contradiction, thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. He's sort of saying that's going down the wrong road, and that results in the reactionary approach results in diminishing everything it touches, something like that.
You know, there's a sense in which Schopenhauer seems to me to be developmentally appropriate. I'm speaking autobiographically here, to say that in the way that the individual's life recapitulates the species evolution. When I was 19 or 20 or so, kind of depressed and not really wanting to enter into a world and a political system and an economic system that seemed very broken, reading Schopenhauer and studying Buddhism very much possessed me. It felt right, you know. And that desire to withdraw from the world, and in a way there's a kind of pride in it, that, you know, that one has realized something that everyone else is deluded about, that they think these representations are real, going about, you know, trying to vote in elections or whatever, start companies and pursue worldly success as if that was actually going to satisfy anything, the deep longings of our soul. And so, you know, at that time in my life, Schopenhauer seemed to get it. And but that's not the end of the developmental spiral, right? And I mean, longer story to explain how I got out of that, but it seems to me that Steiner's spending time unpacking this Schopenhauerian temptation to acknowledge that in a modern context, and I think still today, it is an avenue that many people who have the inkling of a spiritual awakening will go down, right? Because they refuse the messiness of the world, the complication of trying to be involved, and they don't want to think through it in the rigorous way that and the living way that Hegel was able to. So I don't know. I just throw that out there as sort of. I have sympathy for Schopenhauer. I understand why he went the way he did.
I just want to briefly sponsor you here, Matt, because I've seen you grow up on YouTube. Remember you as a very precocious teenager, and here you're on a young adult, mature adult, and I think this is an immense transformation that's happened, which you've described, I think, very eloquently, with this the pride of that Schopenhauerian withdrawal. And didn't Hegel say something about the beautiful soul?
Mm-hmm.
And wasn't he sort of parodying that withdrawal from the world and its messiness by calling those persons who are obsessed with that beautiful souls? So I'm just bringing that in the mix, and curious how you got out of that. You said that's another story, but I'm very curious about how you got out of that. Thanks.
I'll share a bit more about that maybe in another forum, maybe in an email, or I'll do it on Volley. Yeah. Angus, I see your hand.
Yeah, building on what you're saying there, Matt, and probably using different words. So there's a couple of polarities that come out like very, very clearly in this chapter for me. It's obviously reason and unreason, which like talks to what you were talking about as like purposelessness in there, and that these are real experiences for all of us. There are times when we feel we understand the world, we've got the conceptual framework to understand what's going on, and then sometimes like reality's like hits us on the head. Your guy on the tracks there that you're talking about, John, so like it seems to, it's like there seems to be no explanation of it, and yeah, that's how we sort of like confront life. We're like continually moving between which we can explain with our conceptual framework and that which we can't. But also the relationship, so the other polarity that's going on very strongly here, which also Jeffrey talked about, is thinking and willing, which again talks to the same thing, because the way Schopenhauer's describing this will is like there's no rhyme or reason behind it, and there's no rhyme and reason, so like invented, it's like thinking to explain itself, that which doesn't have any explanation. It's like it's a parody of itself. And obviously Hegel's like represents like, no, there's along with Goethe, this perception, this understanding that's like there's a conceptual framework, there's a spiritual reality behind all which is going on. And I think these are events, these are states of soul that we can all recognize in ourselves in our everyday, when we like stop and realize, it's like think about what we're actually experience. But I think actually Herbert's role in this chapter is very interesting, because he's getting Herbert to talk about feelings, which Jeffrey was talking about. It's like the thesis antithesis, it doesn't work here, if I understood you right, Jeffrey. And I think the feelings in here are sort of like getting that movement going between these two polarities as we identify individually. That's what feelings are. They are individual reactions to it's like this universal event that's happening. And that's where this, so like if we want to get pulled away from the senselessness of so like an unreasoning world, so like our feelings so like pull us, it's like they might pull us in of there, but they can also pull us out because of the security that feeling gives us. But also we have to recognize that there are times when our thinking isn't sort of like sufficient to explain the world, and we have to sort of like have this Goethean way of letting the experiences just live in us until they start talking their reason. And one final reflection on Herbert, if in case anybody wants to sort of like follow up that thought, is I thought it was, I was wondering to what extent it was true, because the picture Steiner seemed to be presenting was that nobody thought about feelings rationally prior to Herbert. I mean, you can read, so like you can read ancient authors talking about feelings, but he seems to be describing here that here we've got humanity actually beginning to realize that my feelings have consequences. Do you know what I mean? And I was really interested in the extent to which that was an accurate understanding of humanity's intellectual development. Were we really, apart from perhaps a few enlightened thinkers, as a humanity completely ignorant of the relationship of our emotional state to what will happen as like when we're in a certain emotional state? So I'm getting this flowing image between like thinking, feeling, willing going on in this chapter.
Angus, it's very interesting. You have Herbart as the as being bringing this feeling into the conversation, and perhaps it's very opposite, because he describes Herbert as a fellow who's an onlooker. It's that typical kind of onlooker consciousness. And so he's able to sort of step back from feelings in this cool mood and then bring them in a more scientific fashion for our consideration.
And eventually it's like leading us to a certain freer relationship to those feelings. And once we have this sort of like this standing outside consciousness, we can look at them and see how they impact what we're doing in life.
I wonder if I could jump in on the feeling picture. Feelings are personal, individual, but they're also the the agency or perceptual device of the soul that individualizes concept. We don't have meaningful mental pictures in the philosophy of freedom sense of mental picture. We don't have a strong imagination without feelings, and so they're also part of the universalizing principle, I think. And I'm going back to this notion that Steiner's asking us to take hold of the soul at this point, and is sort of tracing where things started to go off into what he refers to in relationship to Hegel in spiritual science as a foundation for social forms, as a wresting from Ahriman, speaking of beings who are arcing over groups of people. He's sort of there's a sort of separating off of two streams here in a sort of radical way, which is, I think, part of the result is a sort of radical philosophy foment that comes in the following chapter.
Did someone want to go? I wanted to riff a little bit on what just has been said. Angus, I don't have this well thought out, but you're talking about feelings pull us in, feelings can pull us out, and they're individual. I would say yes, and they're shared. Our feelings are shared in certain, I can have a private feeling. I can also have a feeling that I share with others and that others share with me. And it doesn't have to be verbal. Like the encounter on that train between these two men, there was nothing verbal, but there was a very deep, I think, bond that was there, and that was enhanced by one man saving the other man's life that way. So feelings that pull us in and pull us out. And Schiller and Goethe meeting at a botany conference of all places. Both of them were writers and poets, but they were obsessed with botany. So they get together and they're having a talking shop, and Goethe gets frustrated and he just pulls out paper and pen and he draws a picture. He does a sketch of what he means. And Schiller famously says, that's not an experience. That's not empirical. That's an idea. And Goethe was like, really didn't know what to do with that. And I think that's fascinating, because I think there's something like the feelings that pull us in and pull us out, which Goethe was trying to express. And he couldn't do it in language. He had to show it in a sketch. So I'm drawing on Wittgenstein here. You cannot say it, but you can show it. And I think these are the kinds of the tensions and the stresses that we feel as those fuzzy spaces between personal, transpersonal, personal, subjective, objective, cultural. It's very fuzzy, these zones. And I think our feelings and our affects are absolutely, the more we can tune into them and then enter into a cognitive space, we can hopefully move towards more coherent intersubjective we spaces. Without that, we're going to be in real peril. And I think it's, for example, I watch a newscast, a little flat screen and a little square box. I see disasters happening in the Ukraine, things being blown apart and people running around screaming. And I have a detachment about that. I'm observing it. But then I walk into the hallway and the man who cleans up my building, he's from the Ukraine. He has a nephew who's fighting in the war. He's told me stories about his mother and his grandmother getting out of Ukraine and ending up in Poland. And when I see him, I feel an ache in my chest and tears come to my eyes. And tears come to his eyes. So we're sharing a feeling. But I noticed that I cannot dissociate from the human suffering. When I'm in the room, when I'm in the space with another person who has relatives who are in that conflict, the way I can if I'm looking at a flat screen. So I think the flat screens dampen or decrease our affective capacities, even as they, in some ways, exploit those affects. And I think that's the problem that we're having, because it's hard for us to fill in those gaps with the technology that's coming at our doorstep or on our flat screens or on our devices, and what's happening on the ground to someone, an actual person. So that's what I'm getting from Angus and from Jeff here, is how do we, and I think previously other speakers here, how do we find that gentle empiricism so that it just doesn't become another idea in your head, but becomes something that you can reflect upon an action or episode, and then you can move forward with more coherence. Even when we're incoherent, there's something that wants to become coherent even in those moments. So I do not avoid as much as I can conflict, because I've noticed in my life it just doesn't work. But if you can go into it and go through it, then you hopefully can go beyond it. So I'm just riffing on what's been said before. I hope that makes sense to somebody. Thanks.
Yeah, I see your hand, Angus. I wanted to just comment briefly on this relationship between aesthetics and morality, willing and feeling in another sense, which Schiller is trying to, I think, correct an imbalance in Kant, for whom morality can have nothing to do with our feeling. So much so that even acting out of love for Kant is not strictly a moral act, because it's self-interested in some degree. It's based on one's own affect. And Schiller is trying to overcome that very austere form of moralism, let's call it, in Kant. But at the same time, you can go too far in the other direction, which I think is what Herbart is doing, where morality gets reduced to aesthetics. But I think what we're seeing is the struggle here in the midst of the evolution of consciousness to reconcile these two dimensions of our being. And love is obviously very important from an anthroposophical perspective, not only for warming our thinking, but for helping us direct action. Love's not something that we need to think about first. In some sense, the man in the subway platform was acting out of a love that was almost taken for granted as permeating and connecting us all, such that his ego wasn't absent, but expanded to include the man who fell onto the tracks. So anyways, I just wanted to thematize this tension between aesthetics and morality in the way that we're trying to understand what constitutes goodness and its relationship to beauty and love and all of this. Go ahead, Angus.
Yeah, I wanted to come back to Jeffrey's point about two styles of thinking, two communities beginning to make themselves present in this chapter. Because I think Steiner's descriptions of Herbert's way of thinking is very interesting. It's a mathematical, mechanized way of thinking, where one thing follows the other, follows the next, which is radically different from the way that he describes Hegel. So you've got to involve the life forces to continue the thought, to move forwards, in this conceptual framework. And I'd really like Jeffrey to say more, because that's something that I feel is really beginning to come through strongly in this chapter. We are getting a splitting off or into two fundamental ways of seeing the world, which have a huge impact on the way we think about the world, and therefore our world conceptions. They're both interrelated, of course, but so I'd love it if Jeffrey, you could come back and develop that idea a little bit more, if you've got anything to add there.
First, I just want to say I was a 18-year-old, 19-year-old too, and suicidal, really, and at the face of the world, and we all, many of us probably, who are still thinking about things and not schematic or cynical about the world, had to pull themselves out of something like a what you say, a personal death of sorts, or and then even some people have to confront some social issue and pull themselves out of some sort of social death, and then coming in out the other side is it's a sort of radical place to land. And so I guess what I'm doing is tracing this reactionary point of view, starting in seeing it sort of like you were saying, Matt, it's understandable that Schopenhauer would have felt this way. Yet it's also dogmatizing the merely personal. And that became psychology as behaviorism, which became the public relations industry, which is the social media, John, that is being, it's ripping apart our democracy and threatening civilization. And I think Steiner's tracing the kind of thinking that leads to these things predictably. In fact, in Spiritual Science as a Foundation for Social Forms, and around that time, he was profiting, not profiting, it's not the right word, is it? It was almost like prophecy about where we would be right now. And he was on the money, man, as far as ideology goes, as far as the religious impulse collapsed into the scientific approach. And when you have a Herbart who flattens the soul into sort of some sort of commonality of public utility or something like that, almost a technical model of the human soul. And then you have Schopenhauer depersonalizing the human soul into a sort of, into something that we have no control over at all, no autonomy in relationship to. There's this giving up of autonomy that is not going to, well, it hasn't boded well, let's say. Is that kind of what you were thinking, Angus?
Yeah, and wonderfully expressed as well. It's such a rich topic for understanding how it seems it's like a philosophical sort of like interesting to think about, that these world conceptions are hugely important, because they don't just determine how they see the world, they determine how we act in the world. So those weird little impulses are like coming through us, they get translated into like how we treat nature, how we see life, how we get our thoughts to evolve completely around ourselves. This closed-in attitude. One of the things that I was thinking whilst you were saying that is also Steiner. I can't remember whether it's real chapter 4 or chapter 5. Somebody correct me. But Steiner says something along the lines of basically the materialism in thinking. So like it has its roots in the church. So like in the theological thinking of the 14th century. Am I making this up? Was it this in this book, or was it in some other chapter? But he's basically saying materialism started in the church, and then it made its way through to science, and now it's sort of like getting through to like really through to the way everybody sees the world and the fatal consequences that that this has. Yeah, and yeah, Steiner's there as an antidote, in the sense of like making clear that the consequences of our world conceptions is the way that I see it. Jonathan.
Shall I go? Or is someone else waiting along?
No, go ahead, Jonathan, and then we should wrap up.
It's something that struck me when John was talking, and in relation to what Angus was saying about, so if we have like Herbart's very fruitful apparently in the education, which are very generous words from Rudolf Steiner, I might have said very dramatic, but anyway, bringing us to the video screen. So we're watching the disasters happening on television. And then we step out in the hallway, and there's somebody who's living in the midst of that disaster. But it struck me that we have as much empathy with the fellow in the hallway if we had not really seen what he had been going through on the TV, if it had not been brought to us in this Herbartian observer detached manner. Because unless we had lived what he had lived, if we didn't have, sort of the experience of the imagination, still our Herbartian sort of, you know, it could become a disaster, somehow also assists our empathy for the gentleman in the hallway. Is that clear?
Yeah.
Just to add very briefly, because he talks about, so like, this is the mathematics. It's average people he's talking about, people as an average rather than people as individuals. And that's one of those things that comes across sort of clearly in this text for me, that it's probabilities, it's things that he's saying are true, but they're not true of any individual.
I know we got to wrap up.
True for a lump of people.
But I just wanted to respond very briefly. Thank you for your patience here. But because when Schiller looks at Goethe's sketch and he says, that's not experiential, that's not empirical, that's a concept. And Goethe was perplexed by that, because the sketch was not a neoclassical drawing he was presenting, which to Schiller may have been reality, a shared reality. He was showing something that I think was much more aperspectival. And I think Goethe was making a sketch of the phase space. And I think that's something that all of us are doing the best we can as we work with the technology that we're given and the technology that we are shaping through our participation. We are entering, and the encounters we have on the street. We are responding to we are in a phase space, and it's a field of all possibilities that we are shaping through our participation. And there are many communications from this field. And I think this is why we go back to Steiner and go back to Goethe and go back to Schiller, because I think they really did focus their attention on these kinds of dynamics. And I think we still have much to learn from him. So thank you all very much.
Yeah, so we do have to wrap up. Is it okay if we go back to 11 a.m. Next week? Okay. I'll send out that Zoom link. I'll send out the recording, and I like the volleys. I've been keeping up listening. I haven't been able to contribute much. I'll try to do more of that this week. Just as an example of the way that this technology can actually facilitate this sort of consciousness deepening work that we're trying to do. I think a lot of anthroposophists are so resistant to technology, rightly so. There needs to be some pockets in society that are doing that. But on the other hand, it seems to me Steiner was very clear that there's no escape from this harmonic influence. And if we just turn away from it, we can't influence it. So I, for one, have found myself trying to lean in to transform as best I can these mediums, because they can be used in a positive way. So I'm glad to have some companions in that effort.
Amen.
Amen, brother.
All right.